Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're continuing along with Motor City Drama by Russell Lee Duray. Chapter 4, Walter Chrysler enters the scene at GM. If you guys remember last time, talking about Chapter 3, we talked about the formation of General Motors and how Billy Durant did not find I guess that's a funny way of saying that, did not start General Motors as General Motors, that name, which was actually a holding company started in New Jersey. No, it was from the conglomeration of multiple different companies into one, multiple different car companies. Durant started off as a carriage maker, then moved into the automobile industry at Buick. And then from there, he tried to circle the wagons to get Cadillac, to get Oldsmobile, to get Henry Ford to join in and merge together. And that partly did happen, except for Ford. But he did come close to having Ford a part of that merger. The bank would not give him enough money to make that happen, and the deal ended up falling through. But it seemed like Ford was into it. So it was super interesting going over Chapter 3 and the history of that and what could have been in today's world if that would have happened, if GM and Ford would have merged together. And today we're going to keep talking about GM, but we're going to talk about it from the aspect of a man named Walter Chrysler entering the scene. And Walter is going to here, we'll just jump to the first slide here. And Russell starts off talking about this scene where Walter Chrysler enters the scene, but he's entering the scene at Buick. And Walter is coming in for this job. Walter's coming in for the job because there's this guy that has a newfound love of automobiles after having worked on locomotives, the railroad industry, for such a long time. And he's coming in to GM looking for a job. And at this time, Jim Storrow is the president of GM. All the while, he's sitting on American Locomotive's board. American Locomotive is the company that Walter Chrysler worked for before coming over to GM. And as you guys might have suspect, Walter Chrysler, Fiat Chrysler, Automotive, Stellantis, what it's known as today, yes, this will eventually be the man that founds Chrysler, that car brand that you see around today, Chrysler 300s, Chrysler Pacificas, Chrysler, what have you. I don't know why I'm blanking on Chrysler cars. You see them around. Chrysler 200s, they don't even make those anymore. But the 300, the I remember the Pacifica. There was that minivan too. Oh, the Town and Country. There you go, the Town and Country. There's Jeep. I remember that. Yeah, that's a part of Chrysler now. Yes, this is the same man. But at first, he worked for GM at first, specifically in Buick. And he was started off as a locomotive guy, ended up really getting into cars. He was very much so into engineering. And the story goes that he bought a car at a younger age, and he didn't even drive it. He just wanted to buy the car, take it apart, put it back together again, and just kind of find out more on how these new things at the time, these new automobiles worked. So that's what he did. He comes into Buick. Whoops. Oh, shoot. Did it freeze? Oh, whoops. Nope, it did not freeze. He comes into Buick, and there's this guy, Charlie Nash. Charlie Nash was the head of Buick at the time. And Charlie's offering Walter a job to come over to Buick because he's such a inquisitive mind, not just an inquisitive mind, but he's just a very good engineer. He wants him to come in and take over the works manager position at Buick. That's the position that he had at American Locomotive. He's offering him $6,000 a year. Now, at the time, GM is in a little bit of a trouble. They're a little bit of a tiff. So of all the companies that we talked about in Chapter 3 that merged into GM, only 2 were making money, and then more came into that merger eventually. It wasn't just, Buick, Cadillac, Olds Motor Works, Oldsmobile, what have you. It was GMC. God, what were the names that were there at the end of Chapter 3? There was a General Motors Company, GMC. There was Rapid Motor Vehicle Company, Reliance Truck Company, plus many, many more. But only 2 were making money. So Buick and Cadillac were the only ones that were really making money for GM. So this is kind of going to, as an example of the Pareto principle, where the 20%, how does it go? The 80% of the profits were driven by only 20% of the companies, right? So it's the 80-20 rule. So most of the money GM was making was just from like a minority of the companies, Buick and Cadillac. Now, Buick was very much so declining. GM as a whole was declining. Their resources are being drained, trying to prop up all their other companies. So they need a little bit of help. They actually need a lot of help. So they get a bank to come in. First National Bank of Boston enters the picture. They get a banking syndicate together, and they want to inject some capital into GM to kind of save them from going into a lot of trouble. But this isn't with its downsides, because the bank tells GM and Billy Durant, hey, okay, we're going to come in, we're going to do this. But we see that you've taken a lot of risks, GM. So here's what we want. We're going to give you your injection of capital, but we want stock in return. We're going to give you the loan for the money, but we don't really like you, Durant. We don't really like you. You've made a lot of risky decisions. We actually want to have you step down from active management. We'll keep you as the VP ceremonial title. Not really going to do much, not involved in the operational control of GM, but we'll let you have it, and we want to establish a 5-year voting trust. That means, Billy Durant, you don't have a controlling stake in this company anymore. The controlling stake is divided amongst this voting trust, where Billy Durant's only going to get 1 vote, and he can't control the company like he used to. Billy Durant was ever president of the company until he regains control of the company in 1915, 1916, and we have a blog post about that, kind of delving a little bit deeper into how Billy Durant was ousted from his company, as we see here, but then later, through buying up stock, partnering with some very famous names in American history, famous industrial pioneers, the DuPonts, and then he eventually takes back control and he becomes president for the first time at GM since the founding of GM. But the bankers, they oust Billy. They want to appoint James Storrow as the temporary president. Later on, 1910, a new president comes along, Thomas Neal. I think this guy was a native Detroiter, somebody more close to home in Michigan, although GM started out mainly as a company out of Flint, is where I believe most of their production was. Storrow is trying to analyze what to do with GM, so he asks Billy who should run Buick. Now remember, Buick was one of like the lone bright spots at GM, and even their kind of cachet, their profits are slowly dwindling. So Billy says, hey, you got to hire Charles Nash. And I believe he had a relationship with Charles Nash previously. Yes, Charlie had worked for Billy at his carriage company in Flint. If you guys remember, that was the Dort Durant Carriage Company, so carriages for horses. Remember, Billy famously didn't think there was anything like these automobiles. Things were just a fad. They weren't going to last until he took a Buick around for a spin and had a change of heart. So Charlie comes in, takes over Buick. Their first year sales tank by 20%, but then the next year sales doubled. And coincidentally, the profits went up. Well, this is kind of where Chrysler comes into the picture, because Chrysler, like I said, he started off in the locomotive industry, and he's hopping around from place to place. He's in Denver, he's in Chicago. He works his way up to be a works manager, which I think is a pretty high up position at American Locomotive Company. And it just so happens that this is the same place that Storo is on the board of. I think that's what my first slide said. He ends up meeting with Charles Nash. Alco, American Locomotive Company, kind of sees the writing on the wall, and they say, okay, how about this? We'll raise your salary. And he does this even before he's getting on the train to go meet with Charlie Nash and Flint, because they see, oh my gosh, he's going to go meet with them. They're going to poach him from us. But even though they raise his salary, he still wants to go have that conversation with Charlie Nash, because he's getting intrigued by the automobile industry. And then he ends up taking a job at Buick. So he ends up resigning from Alco, from American Locomotive Company, Alco. I was almost thinking Alcoa, but I think that's an aluminum company, isn't it? So at Alco, he meets with this gentleman, Greg Moore, and he lets Greg know that, hey, Buick is offering me the same salary as Alco is giving them. And Greg says, hey, I want to double your salary. But this is a very interesting response from Walter, because, and this goes to show that it's not really always about the money. There's a lot of other factors. You know, you could always just chase the money, but, you know, how is, like Notorious B.I.G. said, more money, more problems. You got to think about what comes with that. And that's kind of what Walter's thinking. He's thinking, okay, yeah, the salary's doubled, but gosh, I think this automobile thing is the wave of the future. And I think by staying put in Locomotive right now just for the money, I think it's taken me away from the opportunity that is going to come along in automobile. He thinks he's peaked in Locomotive, and he believes, yes, there are more opportunities in automobiles. And like I said, Walter kind of grew up working as a machinist. He started off in this machinist apprentice program, but he was a locomotive guy. He's moving all over the place trying to get locomotive jobs. Eventually, again, getting promoted to this works manager position, until one day in 1908, there's this Chicago automobile show where he ends up buying a Locomobile touring car. I know it says low of it. There was this car company called Locomobile, not a train car, like an actual car. That he has to get a loan for. This is the crazy thing. He gets a loan to get this car to not even drive it. He's just wants to know how it works. He's taking it apart. He's seeing if he can put it back together. So this guy's all in on automobile. That's why he ends up taking the job at Buick. And immediately he gets to work. Things start to improve seemingly right away when Walter gets there. Like in 1911, as an example, Buick had this test driving system where they would let employees test drive the cars. I believe it was the employees. I don't know if... Yes, it was. I believe so. Yep. He set up a registration system to prevent the theft by employees and save the company much of his first year's salary. So he's already, he's already giving the value back to the company in the form of saving them the amount of money that they're paying him in his salary, if that makes sense. Operations are improving. Things are looking great. And then in 1912, he has another meeting with Charlie Nash because GM is undergoing an organizational change. as we had kind of spoken about before, the banks having to step in, Billy having to step down, this voting trust is put in, Storrow comes in as president. He's there for a time, then Thomas Neal, and then eventually Charlie Nash is moving on from Buick to become the president of General Motors. He's got this meeting, and Russell outlines it in this chapter. They have another meeting, Walter and Charlie, and Walter is promoted to the president of Buick. And Walter is nothing short of a stud for GM. He's coming in. He's saving time and money for them. He's eliminated this chassis gloss coat, which saves them time on the assembly line. Speaking of that, he brings in an assembly line. The elimination of that chassis gloss coat increased production from 45 to 70 cars a day. Then eventually they were able to produce 200 a day. They're painting before the assembly, saving time. And then again, like we said, in 1912, he takes over Nash's position at Buick. Now, things are going great for Walter, but he's wondering, hey, when am I going to get a raise here? Because Buick out a lot, and I haven't really been compensated for all these improvements and the profits that are being generated here at Buick. And this was kind of an interesting story that Russell raises here, is the fact that it really seemed like Walter was really for the people. Instead of choosing to eat with one of the higher ups one day, he chose to eat lunch with the regular employees, and just to kind of be with the everyman and kind of listen out to hear if there were any problems, see if he could solve anything for them, etc. I thought that's pretty cool of Walter to do that. Well, meanwhile, again, things are going great at Buick. It's because Walter's willing to do things like that, hear people out, not afraid to make changes. And in the end, those changes paid off, like we saw on the last slide. Walter meets with Charlie Nash again. They're discussing their future. And when he was promoted to president of Buick, his salary doubled to $12,000 a year. But now he wants $50,000 a year. He thinks he's worth it. And Charlie's like, oh, shoot. Okay. I forget how this conversation went. I think at first he was... yeah, the conversation Russell has here, quote, it's on page 22, 50,000, holy shit, that is a big step from your base of 12,000. And Walter says, I know, but I have a better idea of what other companies pay for manufacturing people like me. There are some good opportunities out there in the industry. Charlie nodded, you're right, we are about ready to do something more for you, but 50,000 is out of the question. So Charlie goes to the board for approval for, I think it was 25,000 the next year, and then after that, 50,000. And the board approves. So Walter gets that raise. And in the meantime, he hasn't gotten a raise in 3 years since starting at GM. He was seeking $25,000 a year. Nash talks to Storrow and wants to give Walter that raise. So he gets it for the $25,000 a year, but then after that, Walter demands $50,000 a year. Would not be the last raise he gets, all rested on Billy coming back to power at GM, because this is eventually what happens. Billy, again, gets ousted from having sole control of GM. He goes on to form these other automobile companies, Little Motor Company and Chevrolet Motor Company, focusing mainly on Chevy. He forms another holding company. He forms a conglomerate, and I talk about this a little bit in the blog post about this. He forms a larger Chevrolet Motor Company that ends up buying all the other little Chevrolet companies around the country. And he uses that to incorporate Chevrolet to then trade in Chevrolet stock for GM stock. The voting trust was set to expire, so Durant started buying up stock prior to the voting trust expiring in 1915. He's doing it with the help of a couple characters, Hoffman, Rashkov, who was the treasurer at DuPont, and then Pierre DuPont himself. Durant ends up with a lot of the stock. Chevrolet ends up with more than half of the stock. And they end up having a controlling interest in GM. And like I said, that would not be the last raise that Walter gets there. Dun, dun, dun. And there are my sources, guys. That's going to do it for this episode. Check out the blog post, though. I talk a lot about Billy's comeback to GM. I try to get into a little more detail there. Specifically, this episode was a little bit more focusing on who Walter Chrysler was. Again, some guy who started off in Locomotive, started off from a very young age, bounced around the country working from, railroad industry company to railroad industry company until eventually he saw the potential in the automotive industry and jumped ship. And what we are eventually going to see, let me see, what is Chapter 5? Billy's Road Back to Power. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But eventually, I think we really go deeper into Walter's story and the founding of Chrysler, Chapter 8. So we still got a little bit until that. Guys, thank you very much. Follow me on Twitter. Just got a Twitter for the channel. If you want to see when I'll be posting maybe some sneak peeks on the blog. I'll let you guys know when new episodes are coming out. If you're not on Twitter, I got a Float account. And then, like I said, check out that blog. These are the sources that I referenced throughout this slideshow, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. I really, really appreciate it. And stay tuned for more content coming your way. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.